and a National Guard regiment. Sorry. On Christmas Day, the strikers' families and their supporters flooded into the factory plaza. The chief of Cleveland police climbed to the top of a wooden platform and read off the Ohio Riot Act, which required they leave or face 10 years in prison. The company's administration had expected it to work like magic. After, in the spirit of principled disobedience, quote, absolutely nothing changed. Bayonets of the National Guard stationed in the plaza were thrust upon the masses of people, who panicked and rushed toward safety. There were too many, and they overwhelmed the guard. Quote, a youth jumped onto a soldier's back like a monkey, then another and another. That's when the shooting started. Factory guards and specialty sharpshooters injured 23 people and killed 14, including an infant. While no one would ever admit to ordering the guards to fire upon the crowd, afterwards, quote, there was the general satisfaction that honor had been served and that justice had been done. Law and order had been restored. So like I said before, this is a sort of a paraphrase of an epilogue leading into Jailbird by Kurt Vonnegut. And of course, this isn't an exactly accurate account. It's sort of an amalgamation of a couple different instances that Vonnegut had witnessed over the course of his tenure as a reporter in the industrial Midwest. But a couple of the aspects of that story are absolutely factual. So first, the Ohio Riot Act still exists. And it's a crazy thing that they use to sort of bust up protests and union organizing all across the state. Some of the first strikers in the country were killed in Cleveland at Cuyahoga Steel. There had been reports in the later 19th century of a baby being shot and killed in strikes in Milwaukee. And the Cleveland/Youngstown area, so sort of that northeastern part of Ohio, which has always been a sort of iron and steel haven in this country, has seen some of the most violent uprisings and strikes between the years of 1860 and 1930. So what this is meant to show is that poverty marginalization is real, and that it has both system and belief. So there's aspects of it in the world and then also in principles of belief and principles of ideology. And the easiest way to identify poverty marginalization is rampant wealth inequality. And that exemplifies itself in a number of ways through working conditions, through lack of career and college opportunities, in lesser healthcare outcomes. So in all, the result of wealth inequality is a gap in the quality of life. And this paper isn't necessarily about whether or not our current state of affairs justifies principled disobedience in the face of wealth inequality. Really, all it asks is whether, from a political philosophical point of view, does wealth inequality ever justify principled disobedience? So again, the idea is that you're allowed to make your own conclusions as to whether or not we actually live in a society where wealth inequality has become so rampant. But I'm now going to do my first wink at the camera. And again, you can decide for yourself if we're living in the sort of state that I'm describing. So again, just, the idea is whether or not rampant economic inequality justifies acts of principled disobedience. And principled disobedience, according to Candace Delmas, who wrote A Duty to Resist, When Disobedience Should Be Uncivil, which is also a really principled text for the paper. She describes principled disobedience as, quote, illegal acts of resistance that are politically or morally motivated, which is pretty vague. But essentially the idea is that if you're committing acts of militancy or violence for the sake of moralistic or political ends, that's what qualifies as principled disobedience. And I'm just going to show the book here. It's 2018. It was printed by Oxford. Candace Delmas, A Duty to Resist. Really, really good stuff. And we're going to be talking about it a lot over the course of the next 20 minutes. And then also, of course, John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, seminal text for anybody looking to do political philosophy. Just outstanding work from 1971. And again, just because we were talking about it yesterday, and this might be the only group of people who actually know or care, but I myself am in John Rawls's philosophical lineage, which is exciting to me. I tell my family that, and no one seems to understand or care very much, honestly. So getting into the sort of weeds of it, there's two kinds of principled disobedience that Delmas describes. So first is civil disobedience, which is, as it sounds, there's commitments to the basic norms of civility. And then there's uncivil disobedience, which makes no attempt to be civil and is often marked by being covert, evasive, anonymous, or deliberately offensive. So the question of the paper is, where does resistance to economic inequality fall within that scheme? And again, it's not about the current state of affairs. It's just hypothetical justification for principled disobedience in the face of economic injustice. So we start first with John Rawls, and we ask, does John Rawls's current account of civil disobedience justify the sort of disobedience that we're discussing here. So in his theory of justice, Rawls allows certain acts of civil disobedience, but there are really, really intense constraints. And I just want to sort of tagline, we're not talking about uncivil disobedience yet. Rawls says uncivil disobedience is never justified. And then for civil disobedience, he says that there are very specific requirements for when principled acts of civil disobedience are justified. And again, sort of getting into the weeds a little bit, Rawls has two separate categories for the moral obligations that we have to others. There's the natural duties, which we generally think of coming from sort of morality or the personal virtues, just interpersonal obligations to other people. And then there's the political obligations, which are more concerned with things like justice and civic virtues. How do we get along in a larger society? How do we ensure fairness and just outcomes and that sort of thing? So Rawls says that we have a natural duty. So that's about our interpersonal, individual, moral obligations just as singular human beings. He says we have a natural duty to uphold just institutions, but only have a political obligation if we receive benefits from those institutions. So whereas, when he says just institutions, generally he means places with constitutions, places that have representative democracy, places that have laws that can't just be unduly overridden by a ruler for any reason. So again, the idea is that as an individual, I have a natural duty to uphold just institutions where they exist, but I only have a political or obligation from justice to uphold them if I receive benefits from those institutions. So he also says that unjust laws, for that reason, because that natural duty to uphold just institutions is so strong, he says that unjust laws are binding if they don't exceed certain limits of justice. So Rawls says, quote, when the basic structures of society are reasonably just, as estimated by what the current state of things allows, we are to recognize unjust laws as binding, provided that they do not exceed certain limits of injustice. So let's talk about what those limits of injustice actually look like. The first, he says, is that the injustice should be substantial and clear. And that's a bit vague. What he really means is that it has to violate the two principles of justice that he talks about in his text. So the first principle of justice is that each person has to have extensive basic liberty compatible with a like liberty for all. So that's just the extensive liberty principle. As soon as my rights come in conflict with somebody else's rights, that's where my rights end. And the scheme that ensures that everybody has the most room to exercise their liberty, that's the most beneficial scheme. And the second principle of justice is that positions and offices are available to all people. This idea that, career and college opportunities, formal opportunities provided by the federal government, state offices, public schooling, anything that the government ought to provide, those positions and offices have to be equally available to all people. And if they don't, and if they aren't, then you are violating that second principle of justice. Still, the problem here is that the second principle is harder to identify when it's being violated. Rawls says that there's a lot of divergent rational opinion on whether or not certain groups or categories of individuals have access to positions and offices that should be equally accessible to all people. So it's harder to identify. That first principle, though, about each person having extensive basic liberty compatible with a like liberty for all, that's much easier to identify according to Rawls. So the idea here is that when he says injustice must be clear and substantial, the idea is that it has to violate that first principle of justice, that idea that each person is to have an extensive basic liberty compatible with a like liberty for all. The second limit that the injustice would have to exceed in order for civil disobedience to be justified is that all legal or appropriate channels have been exhausted, that like every other path to making your voice heard, making your dissent lodged, every other path has already been exhausted. And then the third, obviously, and this is a bit of a curious one, is that Rawls says minorities ought to coordinate their civil disobedience. The idea is that if all groups who have legitimate claims to dissent, if they all sort of perform acts of disobedience at the same time, the breakdown of the rule of law is imminent. Like just nobody will respect the rule of law in general. And there are reasons to suppose that the rule of law is actually valuable, and we'll actually talk about those in a little bit. But ultimately, Rawls says that if you have a legitimate claim to dissent, you ought to coordinate that dissent with other groups who have similar claims. So the question then is whether or not acts of civil disobedience aimed at rectifying wealth inequality fits into this scheme. On the one hand, when we're talking about that third principle about how about whether or not more minorities should coordinate their action to rectify instances of persistent and excessive injustice. In the first case, wealth inequality seems to satisfy that condition, seeing as wealth inequality is generally a pretty strong common denominator for oppressed groups in general, and so it doesn't seem that difficult to coordinate a campaign aimed at rectifying wealth inequality. The second principle that he talks about ensuring that all legal or appropriate schemes have already been utilized or exhausted, that's a bit more difficult. Obviously, if money has saturated politics to a certain level, there may not be legal or political recourse for the poor to enact their own liberation. So again, wink at the camera, you can determine whether or not money has saturated politics to that extent in the society that we live in currently. But then third, that first principle that he talks about, the clear and obvious intrusion of that first principle of equal liberty, that's not really satisfied when you're thinking about wealth inequality. The idea here is that wealth inequality, the reason that Rawls really puts in that second principle of justice, and also that sort of appendix underneath, the difference principle about making sure that you scrape off sort of the cream at the top and rearrange it such that it benefits the least well off, that's really what's meant to rectify wealth inequality. So it doesn't seem to justify that first idea that, you know, there are sort of clear and obvious instances of injustice, and as such, you know, that would justify civil disobedience. So ultimately, what we see under Rawls' scheme is that wealth inequality doesn't really justify acts of principal disobedience. And again, just a reminder, Rawls is only talking about civil disobedience. For Rawls, that's the only type of principal disobedience which is justified. So ultimately, unfortunately, under Rawls' scheme, you know, principal disobedience in response to what rampant wealth inequality is not justified. However, the idea is that that still leaves you a whole realm of principal disobedience, which is uncivil, which, you know, disobedience with regards to wealth inequality might actually find a place within that scheme. Of course, though, what we first have to do is justify uncivil disobedience, which, you know, it's interesting. It's funny to me that it took until 2018 to get a really substantial text in political philosophy that attempts to justify uncivil disobedience, but Delmas does a really good job. So first, she emphasizes the liberatory character of her account, especially compared to Rawls's. So she says that her account sort of gives back agency to people who have been systemically oppressed for some time. She also argues that, Rawls argues that civility is valuable in disobedience because it shows a general respect for the rule of law at large. So that's what we were talking about earlier. Rawls doesn't want groups who have been systemically oppressed to all sort of strike or enact or to perform acts of civil disobedience at the same time, because the rule of law ultimately breaks down. So the idea on Delmas's view is that by showing respect for the rule of law, you're actually distorting the political reality. So this is what she says. Quote, for activists, outward submission to law did not in fact reflect their endorsement of the system's legitimacy or their acceptance of a moral duty to obey the law. So the idea here is that, you know, if we're just respecting the rule of law because that's what we ought to do in a civil society, it's not being genuine. You're being disingenuous. When you're performing acts of disobedience, in truth, you are always showing that the law is problematic. You're always showing disrespect for the law. And so by doing it in a way that's nominally civil, what you're doing is sort of, you know, you're lying a bit to society. So the idea here is actually that the American, and Delmas talks about this, she says the American civil rights movement was only civil for tactical or optical reasons. It wasn't ideal political, philosophical concerns that led the American civil rights movement to performing acts of civil as opposed to uncivil disobedience. And if you actually look at the writings of Martin Luther King, he's sort of the opinion that the only thing that stands between you know, the civil rights movement in the United States performing uncivil acts of disobedience is white squeamishness. This idea that if you see people performing acts of militant or uncivil disobedience on television, you're not going to respond to those movements as effectively as you would if you saw them being more civil. So there's three main arguments for civility and disobedience that Delmas addresses, and she sort of shows why they're fallacious. So the first is that it makes a movement less successful. Again, we already talked about this a little bit. Violence doesn't necessarily mean incivility, or I should say incivility doesn't necessarily mean violence. There are plenty of other modes of uncivil disobedience that can be covert or else intentionally offensive, that aren't necessarily civil in and of, or aren't necessarily violent in and of themselves. But moreover, she says that it actually undervalues the work done in social movements that haven't realized their perceived or their ideal outcomes. So the idea here is that those women who went to the factory in Cleveland and they just said, we want to stand here and show you that we're resistant to this action, even though nothing came to fruition, even though their families didn't get those jobs back, the idea is that that's still valuable forms of principled disobedience, and that under her scheme, that's actually recognized as being valuable. The second argument is that you ought to choose actions which, quote, and this is her quote, foster a just society or foster the just society that you aspire to. And she sort of just writes this one off. She says, there's really no philosophical reason to believe that that's the case. Ends justify the means when it comes to political outcomes. And so she sort of just answers it there. And then the third argument she makes is that it erodes civic friendship, which is a powerful argument. It's the idea that civic friendship is a necessary component of the values of a just society, and that without civic friendship, you can't have relationships with others, you can't build coalition with others. And that makes sense, but she answers that in two ways. First, the idea that uncivil disobedience can be covert. Nobody has to know if you're the one performing an act of civil disobedience, so that civic friendship might be maintained. But then on the flip side, and sort of just getting rid of that argument entirely, essentially, she says that these bonds of civic friendship are a fiction, and that when uncivil acts of disobedience are performed, they really beg the question, who has access to our civic bonds of friendship? And the answer generally, based on people's responses to uncivil disobedience, is not everyone. So the idea is that if we're respecting the rule of law, or if we're respecting the bonds of civic friendship without having, without rectifying wealth inequality or any other sort of entrenched rights violation, what we're really doing is just attributing greater value or authority to a system that isn't really deserving of our civility in the first place. So she says that the obligations of civility only hold in a culture of equals, and that the poor are already excluded from the bonds of civic friendship. So for anyone who is already excluded from those bonds of civic friendship, there's really no reason to suppose that civility is a valuable thing when performing acts of principled disobedience. So uncivil disobedience can be justified, and the final question of the paper is whether or not acts of uncivil disobedience aimed at rectifying wealth inequality fits within this scheme. And I know that I'm sort of running over. There's four arguments, and I'm going to just sort of paraphrase them to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So the first argument, essentially, and actually let me clarify, these arguments are traditional arguments used to justify civil disobedience. What Delmas does is she extends those arguments to show that the philosophical or ethical justification for civil disobedience, more often than not, extends to uncivil disobedience as well. And in terms of the ethical proof, there's not much distinction between civil and uncivil disobedience. Again, her argument is that squeamishness is usually what makes us interested in acts of principled disobedience or in acts of civil disobedience as opposed to uncivil. So the first argument about civil disobedience is from the natural duty of justice, which we've already discussed a bit. This idea that you have to uphold just institutions and establish them where they don't exist. But the idea is that you don't have a duty to uphold a system that has injustices, which are, as Rawls describes, grave and entrenched. And while Delmas can't exactly explain what justice looks like in totality, of course, Rawls writes 400, 500 pages on an entire theory of justice. So as opposed to doing that, Delmas instead looks at the converse and asks what acts of injustice indicate that there is an engraved and entrenched rights violation. So she talks about systemic disrespect, which is sort of public denial of free and equal status. She talks about tolerating the rights violations of non-members, so people outside of or external to the society whose rights are being continuously rejected. She talks about deliberative inertia, or like ideological commitments, beliefs within the community that make it more difficult for liberatory action to be heard or to be recognized as valuable. She talks about official misconduct, which is essentially it's corruption or misusing an official office. And she talks about public ignorance, just this idea that sometimes people don't know what's actually going on. And that can actually be a really, that can be very problematic for social movements or for political movements that are aimed at liberation or egalitarianism. So the idea here is that all of those things described, disrespect, tolerating rights violations of non-members, ideological commitments, public ignorance, all of those relate to wealth inequality. The idea here is that wealth inequality is a sign of systemic disrespect. It decreases the amount of liberty that some people have compared to other people. There are ideological commitments. Think about the bootstraps mentality, ideological commitments that make it such that people are resistant to the social movement. And of course, there's public ignorance as well. If you look at the Panama Papers, just consistently, we're finding out that there is aspects of wealth inequality that we didn't know about, that have been kept from us intentionally. And so the idea here is that from the natural duty of justice, which says that you should uphold just institutions or establish them where they don't exist, the idea here is that we ought to establish a just economic institution because there are instances where it does not exist. The second argument is about the principle of fairness, and this one's a bit more fun. It essentially talks about this rule of fair play. And so Rawls gives the example of truth-telling. This is sort of the idea that, you know, if you are taking advantage of a certain phenomena or tendency, or essentially a norm or a rule within a given society, if you're receiving benefits from that scheme and you're not providing anything towards that scheme, then that constitutes free riding. It's a violation of fair play, and it's a violation of the principle of fairness. And so the idea here is that the wealthy perform acts of, they engage in exploitative or harmful schemes that ensure that they receive benefits from the orchestration of the economic arrangement, but ultimately the majority of people who contribute to that scheme, that exploitative or harmful scheme, they don't receive equal benefits. So the idea here is that wealthy people under, you know, a system that justifies enormous wealth inequality are actually, and this is the term that Delmas is using, it's free riding. It's the idea that there are principles of fairness, there are rules of fair play. However, I'm the exception and I'm not bound by those same rules. The third and fourth I'm going to do very quickly because I know that we're running out of time. The third is this idea about Samaritan duty. It's the idea that essentially if you could reasonably perform an act that might save another person from immediate harm, you're obliged to do so. It's an old principle. It's, you know, often used as ethical justification, political justification in general. But essentially the idea is that obedience to the law is generally required because the state is nominally always saving people from human need. But if the law prevents rescue, if the law is preventing you from saving another person from Samaritan crisis, from humanitarian crisis, then that law deserves to be broken. So consider laws that prevent you from aiding immigrants, aiding voters who are trying to enact different political policy or different economic policy, or laws that prevent you from feeding the homeless. All of those ought to be disobeyed according to Delmas on this account of Samaritan duty. And the idea is that institutions which repeatedly subject members of a given social group to injustice ought to be disobeyed. So there again, we seem to have a justification for wealth inequality as an aspect or as justifying uncivil disobedience. And then the fourth and final argument that she talks about is about the associative obligation. It's coming from Richard Dworkin. I had the quote, I'm not going to read it. I know we're running out of time. So the idea here is that
25 minutes.
Okay. So the idea here is that there's a special obligation to people that we share associations with. Either we obey the law because it's an associative requirement of being a member of that community, or else you obey the law because of the feelings of belonging that you receive from participating in that community. And so those feelings of belonging constitute an advantage that you ought to give back to the social scheme as a result of. So let's do the Dworkin quote. He says, each person has a special personal responsibility for identifying what counts as success in his own life. He has a personal responsibility to create that life through a coherent narrative or style that he himself endorses. So the idea here is that you have to be able to choose your own principles and form of life. So political associations shouldn't allow some to choose their own form of life and not others. For Dworkin and for Delmas as well, it's about a respect for human dignity. It's about a respect for people's ability to perceive of and work towards their own ends. And so the idea here is that political schemes which allow some to work towards their own ends at the exploitation of others, ensuring that they don't work towards their own ends or receive them. The idea here is that those schemes are unjust and that there is no obligation to obey the law under a scheme which results in such inequality. So without respect for the people as ends, there is no duty to obey. And the sort of implicit argument here is that wealth in a lot of places, and again, wink at the camera, you can decide whether or not we're talking about that state of affairs currently, But in a lot of places and at a lot of times, wealth inequality ensures that certain people have greater liberty than others, and the liberty that comes with wealth is actually at the exploitation or expense of an entire class of individuals. So in conclusion, the idea here is that, whereas wealth inequality or acts of principled disobedience aimed at rectifying wealth inequality, whereas that doesn't fit under the scheme of civil disobedience, which John Rawls lays out in A Theory of Justice, that still leaves a whole realm of disobedience, which is uncivil disobedience. And it seems like wealth inequality, or again, acts of disobedience aimed at rectifying wealth inequality, actually does fit within that scheme. And again, Delmas does a lot of work to show that, there's really not much ethical or political philosophical distinction between civil and uncivil forms of disobedience. And at the end of the day, what really stands in the way is squeamishness. She also argues that civility calls for civility is often, it's a rhetorical trick from a hegemonic social group saying, look, we have these norms of civility, you ought to abide by them. And really, ultimately, what it does is ensure that some people don't actually get their dissent heard. They aren't able to adequately lodge their dissent. And ultimately, they aren't able to liberate themselves. So that's where the paper stands. Happy to answer any questions that people have about anything that we discussed.
Thank you, Dan. Are there any questions? I typed one, but as the chair, I feel like I should let others go first. So. Well, I'll hop in here. So Dan, I was really interested in Delmas's book, and I, read that along with another one. I don't know. Have you read Jason Brenham's When All Else Fails?
I have not, no.
Okay, it came out in 2019, and it's called The Ethics of Resistance to State Injustice. And so over here in the chat, no, that was Gail. In the chat, he has this notion of defensive violence. And so I was curious if that's something you would want to incorporate, or if you think that might be reaching too far. And so it says that government agents should be held to the same level as private citizens, and that democratic legitimacy does not do the work that the defender of special immunity. That's that notion that government agents have special immunity to our uncivil disobedience, and needs to do. So this gives citizens the authority to attack agents and government agents and property if they are if they're promoting injustice, which is what you were. Right. So I was wondering if that's something too far from what you're wanting to do, or is that just part of being uncivil, that you can destroy and attack?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is, and this is important, is that uncivil disobedience, we tend to think of it as violent uprising, militant uprising, that sort of thing. I do need to specify that it doesn't always mean violence. If you think of like the dirty protest from the H Block boys in Belfast, that wasn't necessarily violent. What those guys were doing in the H Block, it was covert. It was intentionally offensive, but it wasn't necessarily violent. And so Delmas actually uses the example of Bobby Sands in the book as well. But from the principle of fairness, that's probably the best argument to justify the sort of defensive violence that you're talking about. So this idea that elected politicians or people who are within the framework of the state, they have certain advantages that other people don't, and that actually constitutes free riding, that they're taking advantage of people's sense of fair play. They're taking advantage of people's of goodwill. They're taking advantage of this principle of civility, when in fact, if they're actually receiving these sort of benefits, they ought to be contributing to the social scheme in a way that's beneficial economically to a lower class of people. And if they don't, then they don't get to receive those benefits. So ultimately, I would say if we can show that people who are in elected office or who are in the state, if we can show that they aren't contributing to the economic scheme in a way that's beneficial largely to the majority of people, then ultimately I would say, yeah, I think that sort of violence is justified. Yeah.
Okay. Gail?
Okay, I just wanted to have a chance to mention some of the things I put in the chat. Dan, in your paper, you said because Rawls didn't mention or said you shouldn't use civil disobedience to address issues of economic injustice and inequality, that therefore you turn to uncivil. But the thing is, John Rawls is not the first person. I know he's very famous in philosophy circles, and I've heard many papers that jump off from John Rawls as the gold standard on civil disobedience, but really he's just summarizing what he takes to be civil disobedience as it has, come over 100 years. There are so many examples from the people who you could say really used civil disobedience as a method over the centuries, oftentimes addressed economic injustice. I mean, for example, Gandhi, if it was a 3-pound tax put on new people freed from their indenture in South Africa, or if it was the Ahmedabad mill strike, or if it was people who had to grow indigo. I mean, these were essential economic issues of fairness, and he insisted on using nonviolence. And then you can find A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and King saying that we need a poor people's campaign and we need to use nonviolence. And so you said that the only reason King doesn't want people to use uncivil disobedience is because of American squeamishness. They don't want to see it on television. And it seems to me that if you look at King's philosophy, he explains a much greater depth. It doesn't seem to me that's a fair characterization, because he says, look, we need to live with each other. The day after civil disobedience, we communities, we have to live with each other. We need to target injustice, but not other people. And if you look at Gandhi's philosophy, we are all united. It's like, do I want to hammer my toe? It's like, if I think I'm different, I'm not part of you, I'm in error. I mean, the real insight is we are all connected. And so to say that the only reason that these folks who are known for a philosophy of nonviolence are telling people, just don't be uncivil, it's not just because of squeamishness. It's a real understanding. Our opponent is in error. We are going to use nonviolence to get them to change. Is true, not just reach their minds and they have an aha moment, you hope so, but we want to reach out and change the situation in a way that will make it possible for us to live together after this moment. And if you're uncivil disobedient, even if it's short of violence, although you said it might include violence, is just calling people names and saying, you hypocrite, you slime, whatever, I don't know what you want to say, or how you want to denounce your enemy. Have you looked forward to the question about how the society can be more economically just after you've used those tactics?
Right. So the short answer I'll give is that the reason I bounced off of Rawls to begin was because it was a class on Rawls. So I had to use a theory of justice. So that's why we went with that. But on the point about civility as showing the sort of unity between the oppressed and the oppressor, Delmas actually argues that that's a bad thing. The idea here is that the bonds of civic friendship don't include certain groups, most often the groups who are acting on or performing acts of uncivil disobedience. So the idea here is that calls for civility, and again, this is Delmas's argument, calls for civility more often than not are a way of the hegemonic social group or the economic class, which is most benefited by the current scheme, to sort of tampen down the dissent that's being lodged by people who, because they're excluded from the bonds of civic friendship, essentially have no obligation to respect the laws that are, the tools of their oppression. So the idea here is essentially that the obligation of civility only holds when you have a culture of equals to begin with. And whereas you do get some of that language from Gandhi and from Martin Luther King, Delmas's characterization of it is her characterization of King's early writings is actually that he was in favor of uncivil disobedience. And it was only over the course of the civil rights movement and its popularity, its growth in popularity, that they sort of make this transition over to uncivil or to civil disobedience. But again, that's Del Moss's characterization, and it's also my own personal opinion that more often than not, when people in power say you ought to act more civilly, what they're saying is you're being too assertive. They're saying your discontent is not justified. Calm down. And I don't think that that's valuable. I think that the notion that civility has a place in politics, I think it's overplayed. I think that more often than not, like I said, it's used as a rhetorical trick from the hegemonic economic classes to sort of reassert that people who are lodging legitimate dissent are unjustified in doing so.
Thank you, Dan. That was really interesting, and I put a couple citations over there. This is a big issue in many circles, so I'm glad you brought it up. This notion of the power to resist, and whether to follow the model of King or say the more militant Malcolm X or others. A lot of people dealing with this. So thanks for bringing it to our attention, Dan. Next up, we have Gail, who's going to talk about the effects of violence and injustice on the Honduran people and their environment and their struggle for land and justice. All right, we're going to see how this plays out in real life. So Gail, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me try to share my screen so that I can have you see my PowerPoint. Can you see? I'll put it in slideshow.
There we go. I see it now.
Okay, I'll try to put it in slideshow if I can. Okay, seeing the theme of this conference, I wanted to share my recent experience in Honduras, and where this is a place that I've gone several times when, well, I've been engaged for several decades actually on the about Honduras, and the issues of the struggles for justice, for human rights, and to preserve the environment are very important and central there. So I want to give you a little background on why I was so concerned about it. And my PowerPoint's a little sluggish, so it hasn't gone forward yet there. Okay. So first of all, at my university, I'm the director of the Kearney Latin American Solidarity Archive. And we have an archive that houses the papers of Father James Guadalupe Kearney, as he was known. He was a Jesuit who became a missionary to Honduras. He was a liberation theologian who, after the US government toppled Allende, he also agreed that people should take any means in their hands in order to win their liberation, although he himself was not engaging in violence. He did accompany a group of revolutionaries who tried to overthrow the Honduran government, and it was under those conditions that he was disappeared in 1983. And our university houses his papers. And so I've been the director of that archive. And in my years, I've tried to put on public programming and philosophical issues having to do with peace and justice in Latin America. And also as part of that work, I was able to meet Ismael Moreno, SJ. This is known as Padre Mello in Honduras. And he's a Honduran Jesuit who's doing a lot of really good work in Honduras now. And he had been encouraged to join the Jesuits because of Father Carney's example. And so I really like to work with him and the centers that he heads in Honduras, and I'm going to tell you about them briefly. So I've been to Honduras on several human rights delegations, whether it's SOA Watch or more recently, Share El Salvador has brought delegations down there. And this past July, they had a virtual delegation, which I'll tell you about due to the COVID situation, just like CPP is moving online. So the delegation to Honduras also moved online. Now, you may know that so many of the refugees who come across the Honduran the border of the US are from Honduras. They leave Honduras in a caravan. That's for their safety in numbers. And they come to the US, and we could ask ourselves, why? Why do they come? Now, I want to say that Padre Mello is friends with the people in Honduras who organize these caravans, but his own position is he wants and wishes that Hondurans would stay in Honduras and fight for their rights and fight against the repressive government that they have. But he completely understands why people would be so desperate they would want to flee the country. And he does agree that concerted action is a good way to do it. It's just he wants people to stay and reclaim Honduras. But when you say that, your life is in danger. And Padre Mello has received many death threats, even for being associated with the group that organizes the caravans, let alone his other work in Honduras. So this is just from Axios.com. You may already know that some of the push and pull factors which are causing so much migration from Honduras. There's a lot of violence in Honduras, a very high homicide rate. That has a lot to do probably with drug trafficking, but also with endemic poverty, large growing population, jobs are scarce, and sometimes poverty and gang violence are connected. There's also drought, starvation, political unrest, coffee rust. I'll tell you a little more about those shortly. And then there's the pull factors, the fact that the US economy really needs workers, and caravans seem to be a safe way. And the asylum system, even though it sounds like you only have a 1 in 100 chance of ever getting asylum, that holds out a glimmer of hope to people who are so desperate, who often, as you may know, want to come to the US so they can send remittances home to the rest of their family. Now, there's a lot of studies that have showed that in Central America, there's been a lot of effect from climate change. And even though the government knows about this and says it wants to solve the migration problem, it hasn't gone that step to addressing issues of climate change and good governance in Central America, which would actually really help address the migrant issue in Central America. You may know that back in 2009, there was a coup in Honduras. Many in Honduras call it a coup. Basically, Manuel Zelaya, who had been part of the landed aristocracy of Honduras, had a kind of a change of heart while he was in office, a little bit like Oscar Romero himself. And he began saying he was going to raise the minimum wage and he was going to reach out to Venezuela for oil. Next thing you know, there's a coup, as in the members of his Congress said he was unfit to hold office. They said he was insane, and they were able to get rid of him. And that's considered a coup, even though the Honduran government said, oh, we legally removed him. And since that, the National Party has had a series of presidents who have been considered to be corrupt by Padre Mello and many others in Movement for Justice in Honduras. And the sad thing is, right, Hillary Clinton, so the Democrats as well as the Republicans have been upholding. And currently they have Juan Orlando Hernandez, who, and I know you can't read this all, but this is part of a report from the July 2021 delegation showing how there was corruption in 2011 and 2017 when Hernandez was running for office, and especially there was the shutting down of the polls and 3 days of a blackout of information before Hernandez was said to be the winner in 2017. This caused a big uprising of people who were against him in 2018 and 19, and we visited a lot of political prisoners. And so many people were just thrown in prison as a kind of a scare tactic, and not even charged, but just terrorized, and their families were terrorized. And recently, there's been a study showing that Facebook knew that the Honduran president had a manipulation campaign where he basically, he did all those things that so many governments are doing with Facebook around the world. AstroTurfing, the digital equivalent of a Boston crowd, according to The Guardian. So you make it look like you're wildly popular because you've made all these fake people and fake websites that are all endorsing you and saying that you are great. So Facebook had a role in the election. Now there's an upcoming 2021 election, and Hernandez can't run, but someone from his own party is running. And also the widow to Zelaya is also running. But even though those are two top candidates, the new National Party and her, the problem is there's all these new restrictive voting laws. You must have your national ID card, et cetera. And so it's unclear whether the popular movements are going to be able to dislodge the National Party from re-election. And this is a party where Hernandez's brother right now is convicted of drug trafficking and serving time in a US jail. So under these conditions, what is going on? What is Padre Mello doing? I told you about Father Carney. Well, this group called itself Guadalupe Carney Community. And they were a group that was relocated on land once a natural disaster took away their original farms. However, the private owners of land surrounding them were antagonistic and never agreed. The government had bought that land. And when these women's husbands went to farm palm oil on the land they had been given by the government, the private companies killed their husbands. So these are 5 widows. When people gathered together to protest this, for example, Tabello over there on the left, he and others were thrown in jail on trumped-up charges. So the whole judiciary seemed to be on the side of the private companies, even though it was the government who had relocated them to new land. And so Padre Mello has continued this idea, we must visit the imprisoned and publicize their cases. And Tabello was finally released over, I mean, it took many years, but he was finally released. I was also able to visit him in jail with Padre Mello on this trip where I took this photo. So anyway, Padre Mello won a Voice of the Voices award from Annunciation House, which works at our US border. And part of why we're glad he wins these awards is because we know his life is in danger. Now, Padre Mello is in charge of Radio Progreso, where he has a chance to broadcast, he and his whole staff have a chance to broadcast, you could say, an alternative perspective on the politics. And they're based right near San Pedro Sula of a large population area in the north of Honduras, and they used to have 2 towers, and the second one was so tall on a mountain that they could reach Tegucigalpa, the capital. That larger tower was vandalized and knocked down, and it was very expensive to reinstate it. But they still have their smaller towers, reach San Pedro Sula, where the National Party is more, the people are more rallied against the National Party in San Pedro Sula and other places in the north. Now, Padre Mello also runs an office, the Reflection Research and Communication Team. Now, this was started in the 1980s by Jesuits who preceded Padre Mello, but he's been the director for quite a while. And I wanted to tell you the mission and vision. They have offices, they have a staff, they are a network of organizers. And these are some of the key ideas behind the center. So he says, the mission of the society is a diverse team of women and men who work for the construction of a just, equitable, and sovereign society through reflection, research, and communication, inspired by the values of the kingdom of God and Ignatian spirituality, in alliance and articulation with sectors and people who claim dignity and in permanent proximity with impoverished populations and vulnerabilities. So several key ideas. Living close to the poor, having their concerns as our concerns. And this idea of articulation, so he uses the idea of the bones, right? And the body needs to be coordinated, and there's the various bones which have to be connected and have to be organized. And so he's always insisting that we need the structuring of the social movement. There's people here, people there. If they are not united, they can't come together to throw off this dictatorship, as they would call it. So this articulation, this coordination, this structuring of the social movement is needed. He says, this is something he said in a recent article in September 2021. He goes, the structuring of the social movement is the fundamental strategic task. And this is so because rebellion exists, and in it are the conditions to structure the dispersed. But there is also the need to build on a firm body with sufficient independence and autonomy. So he wants to coordinate these various resistances. He wants to reach out to like Ofranes, organized fraternal order of the Garifuna people, and get them involved with Cocaine, the Lenk people who are also having their lands taken, who are having their environment destructed, and have them show up for each other in solidarity movements within Honduras to have a united front. And he's a little worried that in the elections like the one coming up, the opposition gets splintered and they attack each other for personality reasons when they should be more connected. So yes, so their vision is, right, an organized community and movement dreaming of a Honduras exercising sovereignty, not just being a peon to the United States, from a collective power that achieves human and institutional transformations that lead to relations of horizontality and respect for human rights, territories, and national assets. So this is some of their vision. How do they do it? Well, I already mentioned, you visit the political prisoners, you get the legal team they need, and he does have a legal team. So there's the recording of, you know, have they been harmed in prison? What were the trumped up charges? Get lawyers to defend them, you know, get them sprung out from jail. Listen to the testimonies. That's part of what the delegations do when we go there. Standing with them in solidarity, letting them know they're not alone, that there are people in the US who don't just agree with the powers that be. And Hondurans, including Padre Mello, have come to Congress. They've given testimony to Congress. They've the Lantos Human Rights Commission, for example, and in this way try to also pass legislation so that the US will change its view. So there are all these questions. Marilyn Lacey, a Sister of Mercy, and by the way, the Jesuits and the Sisters of Mercy are the co-sponsors of my university. She always asks this question: where do we draw the line? Who do we decide? Who do we decide who to care about and who not to care about? So Padre Mello is talking about those bonds of horizontality, reaching out to each other within Honduras and from Honduras to the US and elsewhere, looking for those bonds of solidarity. And with this, he started a program called Vamos a la Milpa. And they started this project within, this is a project within Honduras, but looking for support from outside. The food chains were really disrupted during the early months of COVID, and people were scrambling to be fed. And this gave impetus to this, you could call it a community gardens project, a project of anywhere there's some land that's not being farmed and could be, let's grow a garden there. Let's become self-sufficient in food. Just like in Detroit, community gardens isn't just we need food, although that's part of it. We need healthy food, non-processed food. It's also a community builder. And so he started this community farms. Let's have Honduras get food sovereignty. Of course, it's a challenge because at the same time you see that there is climate change and there are disruptions of the climate environment. But to depend wholly on like palm oil or coffee, especially when there's coffee rust, and neglecting the staple foods of Honduras is not a good thing. And so this project is one of the ways in which Padre Mello is hoping to bring Hondurans together to achieve food sovereignty for Honduras. When a delegation goes, they write letters to all these US representatives, and they ask them, can you please write a letter to the Honduran government, letting them know we're coming? Well, why do that? It's partly to get on the radar of a US government, get them to sign on the lines that they care about this movement that's in solidarity with the people of Honduras, that is not behind the national party's drug trafficking from the position of government, etc. And so Pelosi and others are roped into writing these letters, which they do, and then for two reasons, hopefully so that the Honduran government knows someone in the US is watching, but also to raise the issue for our own elected representatives. This is just one scene from the Zoom. As I said, in July 2021, there was a virtual delegation. There was a small in-person delegation that wore masks. And then there was a larger virtual delegation. Any of you could join it. And in July, I just joined the virtual delegation despite having been in person before. And so they go in a bus all over the different parts of Honduras, highlighting the struggle. The Guapinol 8, this is a group of prisoners of conscience who are trying to protect their river in a national park from a mining company that has been given permission by the Honduran government when it actually goes against Honduran law, because the community there was not consulted. And when they just had a nonviolent encampment, but they were thrown in jail. So it's Los Pinares Mining Company. The Water Defenders had a peaceful encampment, but the police called it a criminal organization and threw these men in jail. Now they have to try to get the men out of jail as well as try to stop the mining company. So these are some of the, yes.
Yeah, you're right at 26 minutes. So
okay, I will go to my last slide. Yes, I'm obviously too ambitious, but I want to tell you, well, if I could find the slide, I would tell you about pending legislation. Yes, pending legislation in both the House and the Senate could help improve the situation of the Hondurans. Okay, so Thank you very much. Let me stop my share, and I'm happy to send this, by the way, to anyone who is interested. And I look forward to any questions you may have.
All right, if anybody would like to raise their hand, that was very nice, Gail.
Thanks.
Reminded me of the kind of poor people's campaign here in America, right? That working together to address these injustices that occur.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Gail, for amazing talk. Another one here. I have a question. I think I totally agree with you about the idea of unity and the necessity of the connection between different groups of people, like different classes, different perspectives to make a sustainable movement. But do you have any insights for why there is such a divide in the theoretical realm about whether this unity is necessary or not?
Okay, so in the Honduras situation, and it's not that different from other countries, but
Sure.
First of all, I already mentioned the misinformation campaign. So when there is a party that has a lot of money, they can dominate, whether it used to be just billboards, they could put billboards up, or social media. People may be misinformed about what is in their own best interest and what is really going on and what the current Honduran government is doing. And there's also, of course, being bought off. And so a lot of times, the ruling National Party, the Honduran government will go and say, we'll give you this development money. Now, sometimes it's all pie in the sky and they don't get it. Or sometimes it's not a real grassroots version of development. I didn't get a chance to show you my slides of all the unfortunate so-called development projects, like on the Garifuna coast of northern Honduras, a very fancy hotel that was supposed to bring jobs to the Garifuna community, when really it just brought flooding because of the way they constructed it. They changed the way water drained in the context and hardly employed any Garifuna. So it's being bought off with promises. It's also fear. I mean, the ruling party calls the other side communist. Does that ring a bell? Oh my God, are the communists taking over? This is what the ruling party will say of anybody who wants to organize a grassroots horizontal movement for justice. And so these things are going on. Now, despite that, there's a lot of grassroots cooperation between groups, even women's groups that want to stop violence against women, see the connection to those who want to keep the environment and, look for jobs. And so there are connections, but it's always hard to fight against these large powers. And likewise, with the solidarity with the US, there is solidarity and it really helps. But a lot of people in the US are preoccupied with either private lives or other very important peace and justice issues. And it's hard to get that robust solidarity from Americans that would really help Honduras situation.
I hear you. Thank you.
Gail, Jean-Marie has a question. The first one is asking about the impact of liberation theology on the secular politicians in Honduras. And then the second question deals, and this is in chat, about how Padre Melo's movement has moved from conscientiation to the masses becoming involved in governing. So,
Okay. Right. So I did focus my presentation on Padre Mello because I have that Jim Carney connection from our university and Padre Mello being a Jesuit. And I didn't have time to tell you about the Sisters of Mercy, who also have a community in San Pedro Sula and doing a lot of good work there. So they're both doing good work. I mean, Honduras has a large Catholic population, but as you know, not all Catholics are liberation theologians. It's variety. Some of them are on the side of the conservatives. For example, you have a group of the Sisters of Mercy really really promote Foro de Mujeres. Is a group of women who are fighting for the rights of women to not be harassed at the workplace, to not be killed and disappeared, to have the police look into and try to stop these killings. But the same group, Foro de Mujeres, which has some Mercy associates, also thinks women need the right to abortion because without it, women are going to die in the process of trying to find abortions in a country where they are illegal. So there are always these, you could say, stresses and strains within the Catholic Church about which parts of the Catholic message are most important, which parts to put front center. Now, Padre Mello is working with churches. The fact that so many people are religious means you can do a lot of organizing through the church, but he's also doing organizing just according to communities that come together for certain issues, whether or not they're Catholics, whether they're indigenous people, whether they have African traditional religion. He's trying to build those bonds, those interfaith bonds. What about the secular politician? So the thing is, so you have Mathilde, the wife of Zelaya, who's running for president. I would say that Mello, I mean, certainly they're hoping for a united opposition to vote out the National Party, but I think Mello or Eric wouldn't want to see a particular campaign for a particular person as the A to Z of their message, because they want their message to be more focused on what people can do in their communities and their daily lives. Now they do speak, they have press conferences, they have reaching out to all the politicians of Honduras as well as the politicians of the US, but he's not starting a movement that's a particular political movement. But of course, you could hope, and it's always good to hope that the elections could turn out your way, but considering the large history of, problems with integrity of elections, you can't pin all your hopes on those elections. So there are reaching out to secular politicians, but it's not a main focus of the campaign. And well, okay, I'll stop in case there's other questions.
Yeah, we're out of time.
Okay.
But thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and thanks to Dan and everyone else for being here. If you want to stick around, we are doing Oppression and Malpractice with Kate Schmidt and Jacob Warren and A.G. Holdier coming up next. And then in Zoom room 1, we're doing the land and climate. So stick around if you'd like. I'm going to